The Amazon is the home of more than 30 million people, but including at least 400 indigenous nationalities or indigenous groups or indigenous people.
Welcome to a special series in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, a look within Latin America and biodiversity. In this series, we speak with 10 leaders from the Nature Conservancy in Latin America about different forms of biodiversity throughout the region. With a special look inside the Nature Conservancy's Latin America Impact Report, which details the organization's work in conservation across 12 distinctive areas in Latin America. On episode 4 of our series on biodiversity, we are joined by 2 leaders from the Nature Conservancy. Gabriela Celi, the coordinator of the Ecuadorian Amazon Strategy, and Isai Victorino, community-based conservation leader, Colombia, to discuss the vital role indigenous people have in protecting the Amazon's biodiversity. The Amazon rainforest is often called the lungs of our planet, sequestering carbon and acting as a crucial carbon sink. But what many don't realize is that indigenous people are the true guardians of this vast ecosystem. They protect nearly 30% of the Amazon's forest cover, preserving biodiversity and maintaining the delicate balance that helps regulate global temperatures. Despite their critical role, their voices are often unheard. Their land threatened by deforestation, illegal mining, and climate change. As the Amazon faces increasing destruction, the fight to protect it has never been more urgent. In this episode, we bring their stories to the forefront. We explore the vital role indigenous communities play in safeguarding the Amazon. We look at the challenges they face and look at why their leadership is key to the future of our planet. So today we have Gabriela Celi, who's the coordinator of the Amazon Conservation Strategy for the Nature Conservancy Ecuador. And we have Isai Victorino, who is the community-based conservation leader for the Nature Conservancy Colombia. Thank you both for joining us today. I'll just start off here with Gabriela. Could you talk a little bit about where you're from, your background, and the work that you do for the Nature Conservancy?
Thank you for inviting us to share our experience managing and co-creating the community-based conservation initiatives in partnership with indigenous peoples and local communities in the Amazon basin. My name is Gabriela Celi. I'm the Ecuadorian Amazon Strategy Lead at TNC Ecuador. I'm based in Quito. I'm a geographer. I have a master's degree in social and environmental sciences and another master's degree in climate change. I have more than 15 years of experience leading conservation initiatives in my country in the governmental and private sectors. Nice to meet you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm excited to dive into all these topics and hear about your expertise in all of them. And then Isai, could you give us a little background and talk about the work that you do for the Nature Conservancy?
Okay, thank you, Preston, for inviting us to this podcast. This is something new for me, but yeah, I am Isai Victorino. I am the leader of the community-based conservation program for TNC Colombia. This program is related to all the work that we are doing here in Colombia with indigenous people and local communities. Mostly our work is focused on the Amazon and the Orinoco region. I am ecologist from, I study ecologists here in Bogota. I have a master's degree in territorial planning. I born in Bogota, but I used to live a very big of my life in the Amazon, almost 12 years. So the connection that I have with the territory, with the communities is very strong. And I work with indigenous people in different scales. I used to work in the local communities. I used to work with the indigenous movement with different indigenous organizations, with national indigenous organizations, subnational indigenous organizations, and I work with different NGOs. All these regarding with the topic of co-creating conservation strategies with indigenous people and local communities in the Amazon.
Well, thank you again, both of you, for joining us. The first kind of topic that I want to talk about. I mean, the whole general topic of this episode is looking at the indigenous community's role in the Amazon rainforest, and we'll get into how important they are for conservation a little bit later on. But I think, Gabby, it's a great place to start in the beginning to really give the audience and the listeners an understanding of the Amazon rainforest as an overview, understanding, the geographic and ecological importance, and also, what all is included in this area. So I'll just ask you first off, if you could give an overview of the Amazon rainforest and talk about its importance in global climate regulation and biodiversity.
As you know, the Amazon basin spans an area of 7 million square kilometers across 9 countries: Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana. It is home to the world's longest and largest river. It is bounded by the Guyana Highlands to the north, the Andes Mountains to the west, the Brazilian Central Plateau to the south, and the Atlantic Ocean to the east. The Amazon biome supports the world's largest rainforest, which accounts for more than half the total volume of rainforest in the world. It hosts at least 10% of the world's known species and recognized as a global biodiversity hotspot. The Amazon basin encompasses diverse landscapes from dense rainforests and swamps to savannas and mountains. Its river system, with numerous tributaries, is crucial for transportation and for maintaining livelihoods in the region. Moreover, it plays an indispensable role in water and carbon cycles, acting as a carbon sink, crucial for climate regulations. Amazonian forest is considered a carbon sink, absorbing a large amount of carbon emissions, reducing atmospheric concentrations, and thereby mitigating the greenhouse effect. In addition, the Amazon basin is a huge biome that regulates the water cycle. Through evapotranspiration, it maintains atmospheric moisture, influencing precipitation at local, regional, and even global scales. Also, the Amazon rainforest regulates temperature. By absorbing heat and releasing water vapor from forest cover, the Amazon region shapes climatic patterns at different scales. Also, the forest coverage enhances solar radiation absorption, contributing to climate regulation and energy balance. And finally, the Amazon high biodiversity contributes to ecosystem stability and resilience, allowing forests to recover from disturbances and maintain ecological functions, including the climate regulation. The Amazon basin is the world's richest and most varied biological reservoir, containing several million of species, such as insects, plants, birds, and other forms of life, many still unrecorded by science. In conclusion, this region is of immense importance due to its biodiversity and impact on the global climate. However, it faces significant threats from deforestation and climate change that we will continue talking about these big issues.
Yeah, I think the way you just broke that down, I think we can understand just how important the Amazon rainforest is, not only to the community in South America and in the whole region, but to the world as a whole. Right now, I know when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about environmental action, we throw around the term carbon a lot, like carbon emissions, rising temperatures, and how all of this kind of comes together. But the cool thing in what you just mentioned about the Amazon rainforest is this acts as a carbon sink. So it's sequestering carbon instead of releasing carbon into the atmosphere and then rising temperatures. So that point alone, I think we can all agree of how important the region and this rainforest is for climate change as a whole. And if we're talking about biodiversity, I mean, you mentioned the stat 7 million species. Can't even wrap my head around that. That just feels like so many different species inside this one realm of rainforest. So this region's important not only for biodiversity, not only for climate change, but as we'll hear in a second from Isai, it's also important for the indigenous communities and the indigenous people in these areas. When I think of indigenous communities and people, these are really the unsung heroes of conservation. These are the people that might be behind the scenes, that might not get a lot of press or get a lot of reports about them, but these are the people that are working again behind the scenes, conserving the rainforest and helping us as a global world, stop the effects of, let's say, climate change. So I'll pass it over to you now, Isai, and have you tell us and teach us a little bit about the indigenous communities of the Amazon and all of the groups and really about their importance for the Amazon.
Okay, thank you, President. Totally agree. They are the protagonists of all this conservation. So to begin this, it's important to mention that at the end of the Amazon rainforest lies its most precious gems, the traditional cultures. This is one of the greatest treasures that the Amazon rainforest holds. Today, the Amazon is the home of more than 30 million people, but including at least 400 indigenous nationalities or indigenous groups or indigenous people. Or indigenous people. So, these indigenous people speak more than 300 languages. So these cultures live in villages along the rivers or deep within the forest are in the initial contact or voluntary isolation, preserving their unique cultural practice. So understanding this in a globalized world leads us to understand the tremendous biocultural richness at risk of disappearing. That is the most key point here. So understanding this also leads us, people that don't live in the Amazon, to see other ways to approaching the territory, of living the territory, of being one with the territory, to understand the importance of maintaining the biodiversity, the cultural practice, and talking about us responsibility of maintaining this great and unique socio-ecosystem. Understand the Amazon is one with the people, and the people is one with the Amazon. And we understand this only if we go and understand the indigenous communities that are living in the Amazon. That is like the one of the key points. So if we talking about the cultural significance and traditional knowledge of indigenous communities, I think that the knowledge system of indigenous people are the key to understand real solutions to protect the Amazon rainforest. As Gabi says, the largest tropical forest in the world. So it's crucial to recognize that the livelihoods of indigenous people are intricately woven with their ancestral cultural and spiritual practice that had been passed down throughout generation. That is very important because it's a knowledge that go generation by generation. These practices are bedrock of their strategic ecosystem management. Indigenous people today possess a wealth of unique knowledge about the management of plants, of animals, seasons, climate, and shamanic practice, all of which are integral to their ceremonies and the world they inhabit. So it's obviously from our Western vision, these elements are difficult to understand. to comprehend, to assimilate. But in the end, these elements that make the difference with our knowledge systems are the key to saving the Amazon.
Hmm. So it's interesting, Isai. When I was doing research on this episode and research on the Amazon and the indigenous people, my mind kept going to it's a really famous movie. I think one of the most famous U.S. movies of all time. It's called Avatar, and I kept thinking like what is? I felt like there's a deeper meaning behind Avatar, the movie. Obviously, Avatar is a fictional movie, but as I started researching, it was like James Cameron, the director. He actually based some of his ideas on the script, on the Brazilian rainforest and the struggles of the indigenous people. And I think connecting that to the audience right now and having them think back, because I feel like most people have probably seen one of the Avatar movies, thinking about, what did these people, what kind of challenges did they face? And this is the reality inside indigenous communities in the Amazon of fighting things like deforestation, fighting things like territory loss or habitat loss, having things like big business or big government come in and take over land that you've known as home. And I think we're talking about a fictional movie here in Avatar, but I think a lot of it rings true. You have people in the movie, just like in real life, these people that have this rich cultural knowledge of how the organism acts and reacts, just like you're saying. How the plants act, how the species act, and how everything can be in harmony together. Just like the movie, just like it is in real life. But I just wanted to add that in there to kind of give a connection to the audience and everyone listening. But I do want to ask you, Isai, when we talk about climate change, I mean, Gabby did an excellent job in the beginning of breaking down the Amazon rainforest and talking about the importance. And we kept going back to the term of carbon, how the Amazon's a carbon sink. And I want to understand from your point of view how indigenous knowledge systems, how these people and their knowledge systems affect climate adaptation. When I say this, I mean these people have lived in these areas; they know the area better than anyone. But how are they helping to, I guess, conserve and also adapt the climate when all around the world we just see rising temperatures?
Okay. In the territories and areas conserved by indigenous people, they receive extensive knowledge, as we talked before. Extensive knowledge, tradition, practice of self-governance, and environmental governance focus on sustainable long-term conservation schemes. So, but what are these schemes based on? First, the central element of this management are the principle and cultural code of each indigenous people. Every culture have different cultural codes. In that shamanic management from holistic vision of the territory where everything is connected, the terrestrial ecosystems are connected with the freshwater ecosystem, with the plants, with the animals. And you talk about this movie, and for them, the spiritual world are connected with the physical world. And the management of both worlds are the key to understand all this change, included the climate change. So all these spiritual world and the physical world, all from a vision of seasonal and dynamic management in the time, which is based on the ecological calendar, which contain different kinds, as for example, ceremonies that must to be done to heal each time, to heal the place, to heal each group, to each plant, among other things. That is one of the points. The other points are regarding all these threats is in several aspects of governance, for example. First, the indigenous people have indigenous governments, which are their own government structures created to legitimize a representation in dialogue and the creation agreement with national governments, with international agreements, with national governments. The other point is that the indigenous people have a common territory. The communities own a territory that they share and management based on on these cultural codes. The third is on the own regulation they make for the conservation of the strategical ecological areas to maintain their livelihoods and their cultural legacy. Fourth, I think, under indigenous management instruments created by themselves. They have indigenous management instruments, and this is one of the most important points for the management of the territory.
Mm.
And finally, in the role of each person in the community, everyone have a role. The women have a specific role. The elders, the leaders, the fishermen, the hunters, the traditional doctors. Each person have a specific role, and all this knowledge of each person is very important for the adaptation to climate change.
Mm.
That is like a yeah, like some points. But I want to put you, for example, regarding to the contribution of indigenous communities to the biodiversity and to the climate change. I want to highlight two examples. In almost entire Amazon, deforestation is lower in the indigenous territories than other territories. And even in some countries, for example, is lower than in protected areas. And if we talk about, for example, biodiversity, we can find that in their traditional food production systems, the number of the species is incredibly higher than other production systems. So in a space of 1 hectare, we can find more than 100 species. And if we go deeper in terms of the use of the forests, the use of the lands, the freshwater ecosystem, some communities recognize more than 1,000 species with different use. So if we understand this is a huge knowledge, a huge biodiversity knowledge, and it's very important to conserve this. So all this is possible because the indigenous government the indigenous government system exists in these areas, and there is spiritual and cultural management. But I want to go back and again about this movie. Whatever, this is important to mention that despite this all great contribution of indigenous people, today they are strongly threatened by, in some cases, state policies, in some cases, other kind of product activity with biggest impact, in other places with the illicit economies that today occur in the territories, exacerbating three important phenomena that is important to put it. One is the emergency of deepening of environmental conflicts exacerbated by the climate change. Two, the increase in terms of social inequality, and the widening gap in terms of land and human rights and participation in key planning and development decision, generating more power asymmetries in policy in national, subnational, and international levels. So yeah, that is the points here.
Yeah. So, I wrote down the stat again when I was researching for this episode that indigenous communities, as you said, that there's more than 400 indigenous groups in the Amazon. There's more than 300 languages spoken, which is incredible to even think about. But these groups of people, these communities, manage over 30% of the Amazon. And you just broke down how important that was and how this is all possible. And then their positive environmental impact of how they're able to, take ownership of these areas. And you're even saying that there's statistics out there that show that the areas that indigenous groups that they take over, that not that they take over, that they own, that these areas actually do better environmentally than other areas. So I would ask you though, because in the U.S., I know that where I live, it seems like when we talk about sustainability, it's like we always have to incentivize action. for it to happen. We have to like reward people for doing something good. And what it seems like to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, these indigenous groups and communities aren't being rewarded for their stewardship. I mean, they're going out there and protecting these areas of rainforest, this vast rainforest, and they're not really being incentivized on it. You talked about policy a little bit. You talked about how they can be incorporated into these things, but in my head, I'm like, how can we reward these people for all the good that they're doing? Because they're not only doing great things in South America, but it's for the world as a whole. So 2 questions I'd ask you, Isai, there is, are these people or are these groups of people rewarded for their stewardship? And then secondly, if they're not rewarded, what does it come down to? Are they protecting the rainforest? Is this because of pride? Just pride of their groups of people, pride of the land? Because in my head, again, I'm in the U.S. and it seems like whenever we want somebody to do something, we have to incentivize action for it to happen.
It's a big issue.
Yeah.
And as I said, the indigenous people are strengthened, but a lot of things. And I think one of the things is all this gap that exists in decision making about development, about the planning of the big territories. They don't have all these spaces to dialogue out directly with the governments and to have decisions. So the existence of and consolidation, for example, for a private consultant and other legal mechanisms, legal administrative measures to guarantee the rights of indigenous people as binding obligation must be fulfilled by the states that are in the Amazon. And through these mechanisms, it's expected that they will be effective, reflect, and apply with each country in the public policies. These measures also increase the participation and the decision-making of the indigenous organizations at different levels of influence under principle of self-determination and autonomy. They have different vision about the territory. They have different vision about development. And we need, as a governments, to understand this and create the specific spaces and create a specific mechanisms to support this. We need to support this at international, at national, and local levels. So this is very, very important. The other is secured land tenure and recognize indigenous right to management their territories is crucial to effect conservation and climate mitigation effort with climate policy. That ongoing and active participation on global climate decisions negotiation, for example, allows advocacy in the inclusion of indigenous knowledge and practice in climate policy. I think that in this moment at the international level, in all these negotiations that we have in the COPs, all these are changing. I think at least in the 3 last COPs, we see the voice of the people, of the indigenous people, are stronger in these spaces. This is the first step, but we need to still consolidate in this kind of mechanisms. We need to still consolidate the dialogue and to understand the different visions. I think that there is this is very important, not as I say, not just at international level, at local level, at national level. It's important to reconnect with the indigenous communities. It's very important to connect with all these indigenous governments, all these indigenous organization structures. And we have a very important role as citizens in the cities that is not in the Amazon, but for example, your role, President, to put these topics in here is very, very important. And I think that is the moment to connect with these communities to save the Amazon.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, my mind goes to global, like a global international policy, like the Paris Agreement, the Paris Accord. This is, a lot of governments around the world have gotten together saying that they want to limit global temperature rise below, I think it's 1.5 degrees Celsius pre-industrial levels. And I'm thinking in my head, I'm like, okay, the Amazon rainforest is a carbon sink. The Amazon rainforest does so much in mitigating climate change and helping against our fight against climate change. And if indigenous groups of people that are controlling 30% of this rainforest are conserving it at such high levels and doing such a good job, how can they be incorporated in this policy, rewarded for what they're doing? Because again, as a global world, their contributions are so large. But I feel like, we started off this conversation saying they're the unsung heroes of conservation. They're the people that are behind the scenes that don't get reported on. But the reality of the matter is, these are the people that are really driving the change. And I think at the end of the day, we need to reward them. We need to publicize it. People need to know about all the work that they're doing. And I think that kind of leads into the next point, Gabby, of really, what's threatening these indigenous territories and communities. We talked about the movie Avatar a little bit. If anyone's watched that movie, that deforestation's a big problem there. Deforestation, and the same thing's happening in real life in the Amazon rainforest. I spoke with Sylvia Benitez on episode 3 of this series on freshwater protection, and she really opened up my eyes to some of the issues that indigenous communities face. She gave a brilliant example of how, in these freshwater communities that illegal mining happens. And with illegal mining comes mercury that goes into the water. And a lot of the mercury gets absorbed into the fish. And it's actually the indigenous people that are eating the fish that have mercury in it and that are being affected. Their immune systems are being affected. So there was just a great example that she provided in the last episode of how, how human action is causing human damage. And it's kind of crazy to think about. But all that to say, I'll just tee it up for you here and just ask, what are some of the threats that indigenous territories and communities are facing in the Amazon region?
Indigenous communities in the Amazon basin face a variety of threats, many of which are linked to external economic activities and climate change. Regarding illegal mining and deforestation, the gold consumption and other valuable minerals beneath their ancestral territory has attracted a wave of illegal prospectors. This has led to deforestation, river pollution, and the introduction of deadly diseases. Illegal mining is devastating to the Amazon's ecosystem, which holds great spiritual value for indigenous peoples and is the source of their traditional livelihood, as Isai mentioned. Other threats are invasion and displacement. Indigenous territories are increasingly threatened, facing environmental destruction, forced displacement, assassination, and illegal invasions. There are indigenous tribes who have chosen to live in voluntary isolation, that is, to not have contact with the modern world. These tribes are threatened by growing agricultural practices, logging, and mining expansion that can result in dangerous conflicts. And talking about health and nutrition, child malnutrition has skyrocketed because the indigenous communities, who are mostly hunters and gatherers, can no longer rely on their traditional practices and diet and have become dependent on imported food with less nutritional value. Also, mining contamination has affected freshwater ecosystems, as you mentioned, and TNC in Ecuador and Colombia is developing a mercury analysis in river systems that are used by indigenous peoples and local communities, collecting data and samples in water, sediment, fish, and human hair. We want to generate valuable information to scale into policy and decision making for each country. And around climate change, indigenous communities are the group most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. They face increasing threats, attacks, and repression for their work as guardians of their territory. So these threats not only endangered the lives and culture of indigenous communities, but also the health of the Amazon ecosystem, which plays a crucial role in global climate regulation and biodiversity. It's important to support and recognize indigenous land rights, strengthen legal frameworks to safeguard their rights, and provide technical and financial support to guarantee these conditions for the implementation of indigenous people and local communities' territorial management and protection strategies. Despite the great cultural and ethnic diversity that exists in this region, even today, the recognition of indigenous peoples is not effectively positioned within the Latin American states. So they are still in a scenario of vulnerability compared to the rest of the society. So this importance of recognizing territorially is therefore fundamental in several aspects, since it is these territories that the relationship of indigenous peoples with their livelihoods take place, and therefore the spaces in which the cosmovisions that tend towards the maintenance and care of nature are given. In this sense, as we shall see, there is a close link between indigenous people and the conservation of territories. And considering the interplay between deforestation, fire regimes, and regional climate regulation, the conversion induced by high deforestation rates generates increases in uncontrolled fire events directly affecting the climate regulation and affecting indigenous territories on three levels. We have environmental impact, considering that climate change disrupts local weather patterns, affecting ecosystems inhabited by communities and increasing the frequency of extreme weather events. It also has a negative impact on biodiversity and natural resources, and it is crucial for community sustenance, altering also habitats, species, and natural cycles. We have a socioeconomic impact. Food security is impacted, affecting the subsistence in agriculture and the availability of traditional food. This often leads communities to migrate from their territories or adapt their livelihoods in response to these ongoing changes. And analyzing cultural impacts, indigenous communities are the guardians of this extensive ancestral and traditional knowledge. So ecosystems changes and degradation on their territories can affect not only their material substance, but also their identity and their cultural values.
So, in episode 1 of this series, I spoke with, I'm blanking on the name, but I spoke about really the introduction of biodiversity in Latin America, and we talked about how systems thinking needs to be incorporated into all things to really understand like the impact that we're having as humans are having. To your point, there's environmental and social consequences to all these actions, to all these threats. I mean, we talk about illegal mining, we talk about deforestation, and I think a lot of times, again, human action, or I should say greed, a lot of greed or money-focused decision-making can cause way more effects than the money that it generates. And I think if people people employed a systems thinking approach and really looked at a decision that they're making, not only in the current state that they're in, but look out in the future and looking at, how is it going to affect indigenous people? How is it going to affect the communities? How is it going to affect the environment? How's it going to affect, how's deforestation going to affect the Amazon in 30 years to come, which in turn affects Latin America, which in turn affects the world as a whole. I think we're missing, as a world, as big business, as big government, we're missing the systems thinking approach to solving problems, because just like the example that Sylvia gave in that last episode, it's like, okay, you're illegal mining, you're mining illegally, and you're putting things like mercury in the water, but that's not only affecting the water source as just water, it's affecting the communities that are around that area and affecting the indigenous people, which in effect hurt conservation efforts if people are being affected by things like illegal mining. So everything comes together, everything works together. But I'll ask you this question, Gabby, and I asked the same question to Sylvia in last episode because it's so interesting. We talk about, environmental and economic. How can you bridge both together? And when talking about indigenous people and indigenous communities, how do you balance something like development and conservation? So again, I'll talk about something that Sylvia said in the episode. She was giving an example of how a dam was built somewhere in the Amazon, somewhere in the water, and that dam was bringing hydroelectric power to the community that was around. So it's bringing energy, clean energy, which is a good thing. But by doing that and building this dam, it was affecting the migration patterns of fish. And in turn, it was causing extinction of entire groups of fish, which indigenous people relied on. So I say all that because I'll ask you this question. How do you balance, as a government, as a economy, how do you balance development and conservation with keeping indigenous groups and indigenous communities in mind?
Yes, I think we have to create frameworks combining these two big components, conservation and development. And in Ecuador, for example, we are working, applying some frameworks that were created in TNC, like the Voice, Choice, and Action framework that allow us to work with indigenous peoples and local communities. We are developing some conservation actions, but also we are improving livelihoods in communities. We have to strengthen capacities, the governance, the local governance, to improve and promote a holistic model. So we are working with the indigenous nations, providing them some technical assistance to improve this management of the territory. And also we are learning from them. They have a lot of knowledge, traditional knowledge that we are also systematizing, and we want to create, co-creating. We are co-creating a conservation model with indigenous people in a participatory way, and I think we have to create these innovative strategies to promote these conservation actions.
So last thing I have for you here, Gabby. Last question on indigenous communities and really their effects to conservation and environment inside this region. I read a quote, and I could be butchering this guy's name. I think it's Peter Veit. This guy's a senior fellow at the World Resource Institute. And he led a research report in January of 2023, which found that forests managed by indigenous people and other communities between 2001 and 2021, so 20 years, were carbon sinks. As Isai said in the beginning, these are carbon sinks in the Amazon rainforest, where forests not only managed by indigenous people and other communities were on average net carbon sources, they're actually providing more than they're taking. So I would ask you this question, last question here on this, but could you talk about the role of indigenous territories in carbon storage and how they act as carbon sinks in these areas?
Yes, the forest management practices of indigenous communities involves traditional knowledge, maintaining livelihoods and cultural practices that helps to the forest conservation, avoiding also deforestation pressures, and therefore enhancing the carbon storage. So the role of indigenous communities and their cultural practices and traditional knowledge, is essential due to the often agroforestry practices, sustainable agriculture techniques, and indigenous fire management practices to reduce the risk. Amazonian indigenous territories play a crucial role in carbon storage and climate mitigation. As carbon storage, Amazonian indigenous territories protect approximately 24 gigatons above ground. They act as significant barriers to deforestation and forest degradation, serving as an important buffer against climate change. Amazonian indigenous peoples are on the front lines of the climate crisis, facing many of the early impacts of climate change while contributing little to its underlying causes. Their role in climate mitigation and land stewardship has earned them scientific and political recognition. Preventing carbon release, deforestation, and global climate change threaten indigenous peoples and local communities, their territories, and the stability of regional and global climate systems. And protecting and recognizing these indigenous lands' rights is critical for mitigating global climate change, particularly if we hope to reach the Paris Accords goal of preventing global temperatures from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius. So lands legally held or titled to indigenous peoples have lower deforestation rates than untitled indigenous lands. So we have to promote this recognition of indigenous territories in the Amazon basin to tackle this big issue. In conclusion, safeguarding the carbon stored in the Amazonian indigenous and community lands is essential to meeting climate goals. The protection of indigenous land rights is vital to mitigating climate change. So, according the World Resources Institute and Global Forest Watch, regions managed by indigenous peoples typically maintain more resilient forest cover and experience reduced rates of deforestation compared to other land types. Many cases studied from various parts of the world, including Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, consistently demonstrated that the substantial role of indigenous managed lands in global efforts to conserve the forest, it's the best option for this, for tackle this big issue.
Yeah, no, thank you for breaking that down. I mean, I think everyone in the audience can understand now just how important these communities are to the Amazon, and in turn, like we've said the entire time of globally, how important they are for the world. You mentioned the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement. Right in line with that, these people are playing a huge part, and they need to be recognized for their efforts. But Isai, I'll talk to you now a little bit about this global impact again. You know, we've mentioned how important it is globally, but I really want to dive a little bit deeper here in understanding, you know, in these indigenous territories. I mean, Gabby just did a great job giving us understanding about how important they are for carbon storage and carbon and climate mitigation. But how important how important regionally and globally is it that we maintain the forest cover inside these indigenous territories?
Okay, I think in general terms, maintain forest cover in indigenous territories can contribute to the conservation of biodiversity in so many ways. For example, um, it, conserving important representative ecosystems that are threatened and that are unique in these indigenous territories. Habitats and wildlife corridors, supporting the recovery of threatened species, preserving habitat connectivity, and protect these endangered species. Also, the forests can help us to regulate local and regional high hydrological cycles, maintain steady water flows, prevention soil erosions, flood and disaster mitigation, and all these practices can contribute to the climate change adaptation in local level, but also connecting this at global level. I want to put I want to highlight two examples. For example, I don't know if you know about the flight rivers. The flight rivers. There are air currents that bring water vapor from the Amazon in the equatorial zone, North and Southern America, and down as far southern northern to Argentina. So the humidity carried by these airborne rivers is the responsible for much the rainfall in different parts in Brazil, in Argentina. So this is how we can connect in terms of global, the things that are happening in the Amazon affect other areas that is not in the Amazon, that is in other ecosystems around the world, and in this specific case in Latin America. Another example, maybe Sylvia talk about that, is about the migratory fish.
Hmm.
The Amazon catfish carry out one of the largest migratory in entire world. This is the people don't know this, but it's an incredible migratory. And this is only possible if rivers remain free flowing and and the governance of these rivers are in hands of indigenous people. So the important to conserve a specific territory is very important for whole the world, for whole the region, for entire world. So yeah, this is very important, and we need to recognize and support indigenous lands rights and governance are critical for sustainable these benefits. Ensure both the local well-being and global environmental health. We are talking about the global environmental health. If we want to support this, to consolidate and to maintain this, we need to conserve the Amazon, and we need to conserve the Amazon that is in hands of in the indigenous people in the indigenous territories.
So I'll give another example of a TV show or movie, because that's just how my mind works, I guess. But I think about, there's another U.S. TV show called The Office, and it's a sitcom. It's a funny show, but it's basically based in New Jersey, I think is where it is. Scranton, no, Scranton, Pennsylvania, I think. And in The Office, there's a guy named Dwight Schrute, and when Dwight he ends up leaving the office, leaving the company, because he was kind of fed up with how everything was happening. And once he left, everything in the office just went to crap, basically. Like all these little things started going wrong. And what the people in the office found out was Dwight was actually like managing the whole office behind the scenes, and nobody really knew. So when he left, everything like went to crap. There's problems everywhere. And I'll relate this directly to the Amazon rainforest. If the indigenous community and the indigenous people were to just leave one day, or if one day they're like, "Hey, we're not gonna do our due diligence, do our work anymore, conserving the rainforest," then I think you would see a very similar thing to what happened in that TV show of all these things would start going downhill. You'd start having wildfires, you'd start having flooding, you'd start having, instead of a carbon sink, you'd have rising temperatures. I mean, I just think of complete destruction. And, that you're opening up my mind and helping me see just how important these people are to this area. So, the last segment that I want to talk about to both of you, opening up to both of you, is understanding the Nature Conservancy's work with Indigenous communities. I think both of you have talked about it a little bit in each of your segments in this talk, but I really want to open this up to both of you to understand, what else is the Nature Conservancy doing to protect and enable this hugely important group of people.
Okay, so one key message: conserving the Amazon is a global priority in this moment for everyone. The current situation requires an ambitious solution that comprehensively cover a problem that is environmental, as we talk, but also social, economical, and cultural. And that is why the indigenous people and local communities that inhabit these territories become the main protagonists and partners to achieve this goal, to conserve the Amazon. So we need to create real connections with indigenous people to achieve this goal. So TNC have a global strategy to support this unique work. And in different countries, we are implementing specific actions. In Ecuador, in Brazil, in Peru, in Colombia. And the work with indigenous people and local communities that TNC are doing is based on building relationships, honoring the self-determination, establishing trust, and focusing on shared interest. If we really create this real connection with indigenous people and support all these indigenous governments, all the conservation of traditional knowledge, we are going to achieve this goal. So TNC is working hand in hand with these kind of communities. As Gabriela said, we have a framework, the Voice, Choice, and Action framework is intended for situations where human well-being and environmental outcomes are linked and interdependent, where the leadership of the indigenous people is essential to achieve shared goals, where power imbalance may hinder achieving positive results for people and nature, and where projects make significant impact on local communities. So this framework have 4 pillars. One is secure rights over lands, water, and resources. The second pillar that is very important is to strong leadership, governance, and management capacity of the leaders, of the communities, of the indigenous organization. We have to have a strong leadership capacity. The third is to support or to create effective multi-stakeholder dialogue and decision-making regarding to the development, regarding the use of the territory, and to connect this kind of decision with national governments, with subnational governments, with the international negotiations. As TNC, we are doing this work. And the protagonist of this work is the indigenous people. And the fourth pillar is to consolidate sustainable livelihood opportunities, because the people live with the forest, and the forest is one of the people. So we need to create all this kind of vision of socio-bioeconomic opportunities where the people are going to still living from the territory. That is like in general terms. And I don't know, Gabi, if you want to do an example, for example, about the work that we are doing in Ecuador, and I can do other for Colombia.
Yes. And we are sorry. So we have 2 examples that we want to share with you about the work we are doing in each country. In Ecuador, as part of this vision, TNC Ecuador has identified an opportunity to protect a free-flowing river in the Ecuadorian Amazon we have support to indigenous nations to create a protection scheme for a fluvial system that includes three main rivers, the Nuxinho, Curaray, and Villano rivers, which are tributaries of the Napo River that flows to Peru and drains to the big Amazon River. The community fluvial reserve limits with a national park that is a protected area, and we are creating a big freshwater corridor. This fluvial reserve aims to establish durable freshwater protection in more than 1,800 kilometers of free-flowing rivers and 26,000 hectares of wetlands within an area of 370,000 hectares of primary and secondary tropical rainforest. In this fluvial system, there are 80 communities that represent more than 4,000 people. So local communities recognize the importance of protecting these rivers that sustain their livelihoods. I think it's the first conservation area in Ecuador that implement the free, prior, and informed consent procedures previous the designation process. So TNC facilitate this process respecting the IPLC rights, indigenous peoples and local communities rights. So in Colombia, we have another example.
And it's similar. We are working in Colombia. In the Colombian Amazon TNC is working with at least 4 indigenous organizations and other several rural campesino communities. The name here in Colombia is campesino, to consolidate a intercultural conservation mosaic. An intercultural conservation mosaic that have more than 300,000 hectares in an area of high deforestation. Here, the indigenous people are working with the rural communities. They are working together to establish different management agreements to promote conservation action, to coordinate with the local government, to coordinate with the national government, and try to create a specific area where the indigenous people and the rural communities are working hand in hand to have a more healthy territory. And this is very important because we are talking about a territory that have a lot of threats of deforestation, of different things. So we are, as TNC, we are supporting this work, and this work is led by the indigenous organizations. So that is like the most important thing that we are doing as TNC is supporting the work led by indigenous people and local communities.
So the final question I'll ask both of you, we can start off with Gabby here. It's going to be the same question, but I just want to hear your final thoughts on this for both of you. So for all the listeners out there in the audience, there could be someone listening from Australia, someone listening from the US, from Africa, all over the world. But if you could leave them with one thing about the indigenous people, the indigenous community, one takeaway, one thing that they can take with them and have, what would be that one thing?
So I think when we are implementing conservation projects, conservation initiatives in partnership with indigenous peoples and local communities, we have to respect their rights. We have to respect their cosmovision. We have to improve maybe some knowledge, some practices that are affecting their territories. So we have to identify with them. We have to plan. We have to track the actions that we are doing, always respecting their rights. So as in the example that I mentioned, in Ecuador, we have a lot of social and environmental problems regarding the regarding the state sometimes violate or not respect indigenous rights. So TNC is leading some strategies to avoid that kind of action. So we have to promote these conservation activities, conservation strategies, linked to another strategies like promoting or enhancing maybe the governance, the local governance, and creating some capacities in indigenous peoples to improve the management of their lands.
And I think that we talk a little about this at the beginning, but I think that it's very important to recognize that as we have knowledge systems, the indigenous people have traditional knowledge systems, and we have to create a dialogue between these knowledge systems to create real solutions to save the Amazon. We need to understand that the traditional knowledge system is linked to the all this shamanic management of the territory that connect the spiritual world and the physical world. So this is very maybe is very complicated for us, but we need to create this dialogue between knowledge systems, and we need to put in the center the people. We need to understand that the Amazon is one with the people, with the indigenous people, and the indigenous people is one with the Amazon. So we need to stop just talk about the carbon storage or stop about the deforestation. No, this is a complexity problem, and we need to have this holistic vision to create this innovative solution. So at the end, we must understand that the conservation of the Amazon represents the conservation of the life on the planet. Everyone, we can all contribute in various ways. But main one is that the society, we must work hand in hand with indigenous people to guarantee that this knowledge, those practice, and those ways to see the world are not we can lose it, and that is a tax for everyone.